Good evening, friends. I welcome all of you on the behalf of USANAS Foundation. Today, we are back again with one of our dialogues in the USANAS Dialogue series. And today, our panel discussion is on a very interesting topic, and that's the role of international organizations in the Israel-Hamas conflict. Well, I guess, when we contemplate upon this question of the role of international organizations, I think the question is very fundamental. It's not just about the Israel-Hamas conflict, but the way the world order is changing. We need to really contemplate and think about the role of international organizations in all the conflict, be it Hamas-Israel conflict, Nagorno-Karabakh, or the Chinese aggressions in the Himalayan borders. The question arises whether the international organizations are failing us, or they still have a potential and a lot to make difference, a big role to play. That's a big question which we should be asking, all of us, the strategic community in particular. After the First World War, we all came up with this League of Nations just to have some sort of an international organization which can induce some balance, some moderation in resolving the global conflict. But then we saw that the League of Nations failed. After the Second World War, we came up with United Nations system, the Washington Consensus. That system prevailed more or less successfully for about 50 to 60 years. But over the last 10, 15 years, we see that all kinds of nation-state rivalries are back in the game, and the classic realistic world order, where you define the world order in terms of chaos, that can be seen again. So once again, we are asking this question: what is the role of international organizations? Particularly, this Israel-Hamas conflict has majorly brought it up. We recently saw that from the Israeli side, there was a major criticism of the UN Secretary General because of his stand on this conflict. But at the same time, we also see that in the UN General Assembly, different proposals for the ceasefire are getting blocked. They are being supported by some powers, but some powers are vetoing it, let's say US and some other powers also. So then the question arises, what exactly is the role of international organizations? Even India, for that matter, we have had our own issues with the international organizations when it comes to the Kashmir conflict. India has, and rightly so, always complained that the international organizations were not able to take a very objective view of the conflict in Kashmir. Mostly, the narrative which prevailed in the international organization, that's sort of biased, slightly anti-India biases, or it could not appreciate, or it could not fully understand the concerns of terrorism pertaining to Jammu and Kashmir. So these are the issues which we all really need to think about. What is the role of international organizations in the nation-state rivalries, also with regard to the problem and the challenge of terrorism, radicalization, extremism? When they define human rights, fundamental rights, then what is the right balance between tackling these challenges of security and also ensuring the smooth flow of the regimes of human rights and fundamental rights? So for discussing this today, we have a very distinguished panel of eminent experts from various parts of the world today. And without wasting much time, I'll just introduce all of them first, and then we'll start with their opening remarks. So let me introduce Dr. Eric Loeb. Dr. Eric Loeb is Associate Professor and Graduate Program Director for Political Science, Politics and International Relations at the Florida International University. We have today with us Ambassador Ashok Sajjanhar, who is a great friend and mentor, and also a guide for USANAS Foundation. He has been the former ambassador of India to Kazakhstan, Sweden, and Latvia, and he's also a member of USANAS Foundation's advisory board. Right from our beginning, our inception, he has been with us, and he has blessed us with his useful insights and also a great support. We have with us Dr. Bohrer, Senior Lecturer at Bar Ilan University Faculty of Law, and he's an expert in public international law. Then we have another expert, Dr. Goldman, and let me read his introduction. Robert K. Goldman is a professor of law and Louis C. James Scholar at American University, Washington College of Law. He's also a faculty director of the War Crimes Research Office and co-director of WCL's Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. In 2008, he was elected a commissioner and member of the executive committee of the International Commission of Jurists, and since 2014 was its vice president. In July 2018, Professor Goldman was elected president of ICJ. And I forgot to mention a small part of Dr. Lob's introduction. Dr. Lob is an associate professor of Department of Politics and International Relations, and he is the author of Iran's Reconstruction Jihad, Rural Development and Regime Consolidation After 1979, the excellent book which was published by Cambridge Press in 2020. So I'll first invite Dr. Eric Lob to start with his opening remarks on the subject. And each speaker will have about 10 to 12 minutes for their remarks. And after the opening remarks are over, we'll have a small short question and answer session. Dr. Lob, over to you.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this important panel. It's really an honor. Just as a disclaimer, and as you may have heard in my bio, which again I appreciate the introduction. I'm more of an expert on Middle East politics and international organizations, and my remarks today will offer a perspective on their role, capabilities, and constraints from someone who has closely followed the conflict in Gaza and regional politics more generally. So there exists realist skepticism or cynicism concerning the role of international organizations in the Israel-Hamas conflict, with the view that power politics trump or supersede everything else. In other words, and more specifically, the UN and other international organizations lack an enforcement mechanism or teeth behind their resolutions due to overriding principles of national sovereignty and military might that have enabled Israel and the United States by extension through United Nations Security Council vetoes and arms shipments to extend the conflict. This conflict, as we speak, has claimed the lives of around 20,000 civilians in Gaza, injured tens of thousands more, and displaced nearly the entire population of the Strip, of the enclave. Strategically, the conflict has been detrimental to local, regional, and international security and stability by sowing the seeds of radicalism or extremism and risking a wider regional conflagration. Tensions in Lebanon and Yemen continue to escalate. Shipping routes in the Red Sea have been brought to a standstill. And the United States and its allies and partners have been further drawn into this conflict and away from other theaters of operation. Ideationally, the conflict has taken a toll, I would argue, on the US's reputation and credibility. Nevertheless, through a liberal perspective, and even a humanitarian or humanist perspective, it becomes clear that the United Nations and other international organizations have played a critical role in this conflict in three ways. First, the United Nations and other international organizations have been monitoring and messaging within the context of international law and the so-called rules-based order. They have invoked the responsibility to protect civilians, particularly women and children, and civilian infrastructure. They have condemned human rights violations and war crimes, including indiscriminate attacks and hostage taking against civilians. They've even collected information, or tried to, on the whereabouts and conditions of hostages and worked toward their release. And they have criticized policies of collective punishment, forced displacement, and the prolonged or protracted siege or blockade against flows of humanitarian aid and essential goods, specifically food, water, medicine, and fuel. So in sum, they've really served as a voice of reason, responsibility, and even moral outrage through the speeches and statements of the UN Secretary General, the UN Humanitarian Chief, Martin Griffiths, and the UNICEF spokesperson, James Elder, among other officials. Secondly, before and during the conflict, and within the framework of the Dunantist approach, the United Nations and other international organizations have delivered humanitarian aid and basic goods and services to the population of Gaza and beyond. To the extent possible during this conflict, they've tried to provide safe spaces and shelters to displaced and distressed individuals and families in schools, hospitals, and other facilities. And they've requested the resumption and expansion of humanitarian aid and evacuation routes through entry points, specifically the Rafah and Kerem Shalom crossings. While performing this work, personnel of the UN and other international organizations have displayed tremendous courage and conviction by putting themselves at tremendous personal risk and even losing their lives in the process. And then the third and final role that the United Nations and other international organizations have served is being a barometer or feedback mechanism of international public opinion on the conflict through votes in the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council, despite US veto power and obstructionism, with the UN Secretary General having even invoked Article 99. With each vote, we're seeing more member states, including US allies and partners, voting not just for a humanitarian pause, but a permanent ceasefire and calling for one. This outcome has increasingly isolated the United States and put pressure on it to push for more targeted or surgical military operations, to allow more humanitarian aid into Gaza, and to continue to negotiate another humanitarian pause or permanent ceasefire, depending on the language of the resolution that we'll see, with continued hostage and prisoner exchanges. Behind the scenes, this outcome or this process has provided the United States with diplomatic cover to have sterner conversations with Israel about its prosecution of the conflict and indiscriminate aerial and artillery assaults. In the end, a system that the United States helped spearhead, as was mentioned, during and after the interwar period under Woodrow Wilson and others, has created both opportunities and constraints for American action and inaction. So I'll just stop here, and I'll turn it over to the other speakers and look forward to the continued discussion on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Law, for giving a very bright and insightful overview of the whole situation and today's main theme of the discussion. So now I'll invite Ambassador Sajjanhar, and first of all, I really thank Ambassador Sajjanhar for joining us today. He's not well, he's sick, but still, he has taken the pain to join the event today. Thank you very much, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Abhinav. And if I sound rather hoarse, the audience and the participants will excuse me for that. But hopefully, as I get into the flow, it might become a little better. My voice might become a little better. But first of all, thank you very much for organizing this event on this very important subject. And as you said, it is truly very significant, very relevant. And also the fact that you have got all these experts together to speak about this. Now, we've been speaking about, the role of the international organizations, and we've seen that over the last few years, multilateral institutions have really failed to deliver, what they were set up to do, what they were set up to bring to the people. They have failed to deliver. And, let me just go back not too far, but just a couple of years ago, we saw that when we had the COVID-19 pandemic coming through at the end of 2019, at the beginning of 2020, what the WHO should have done at that time, it completely failed to do. Even when we had the DG of WHO, he visited China at the end of January 2020, and then he was singing paeans of praise for how China had been able to, it had been a very responsible international global player in terms of dealing with this pandemic, etc. And it delayed the announcement that this was a pandemic till about, if my memory serves me correctly, till about the 12th of March of 2020, by which time the virus had really traveled all around the world, not only in Asia, but also in Europe and so many other countries. So that was one area where we found that multilateral institutions have failed. And this was, once in a century. It was a black swan event. It was once in a century event, and still the multilateral agency, the UN agency, was not really able to rise up to the occasion. Secondly, we've had for the last now 1 year, 10 months, the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And it is the duty, it is the responsibility, it is the mandate of the United Nations, particularly of the UN Security Council, to ensure peace and security in the world. And they have not been able to do that. We have seen that there have been so many resolutions, whether in the Security Council or in the General Assembly, but the war has, continues unabated, bringing tremendous pain, death, destruction, and violence as far as the people are concerned, particularly in Ukraine, and the destruction of cities and of the infrastructure. Now we come to this particular issue of the Israel-Hamas conflict, and let me just very quickly flag a few issues as I see them in terms of what has happened. I think all of us are quite well aware as to what the discussions that have taken place in the UN Security Council, in the UN General Assembly. The most recent one, the vote in which more than 150 countries voted for a ceasefire, and then we might be seeing another vote coming up in the coming days or weeks. So let me just quickly flag the issues as they exist and how the global community and also the international organizations, the multilateral institutions should really be looking at it. I think first is it needs to be recognized, and I think not only India, but around the world, many countries have said that terror is cannot be justified under any pretext, under any circumstances. India has been a victim of terror for the last 30 years, more than 30 years, and we know that there can be sort of, so many arguments that can be brought out on this. So one is it needs to be recognized, and it needs to be the whole global community and the international organizations need to come together to condemn the terror attack that took place on the 7th of October. I think it was not only a terror attack, a normal terror attack in which, terrorists come and they start firing at security forces, security officials. Here it was common people who were killed, and the sort of brutality, the sort of depravity, the sort of barbarism that was shown, as far as women, as far as children are concerned, and what was done to the children or to the women in front of the fathers, in front of the husbands. I think it cannot really be described in words, and all of us are aware, and I will not speak about it, but this is the level, this is the depth to which this incident had on the 7th of October. The attack, the terrorist attack on the 7th of October had happened. The third aspect that I would like to mention here is, very clear that the hostages that were taken, 250 hostages, I think the multilateral institutions and the global community also needs to come together basically in one voice to speak out against the taking of hostages and also the release of these hostages as early as possible. About 100 or so have been released, but there are more than 100 which are still in captivity. Now, this is around, we have seen in the vicinity also, whether there are other similar terror groups like Hamas. You have the Hezbollah who have started the attack from the north. We have seen the Houthi rebels from Yemen, and they have been launching missiles and drone attacks against Israel and against shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden and other places. So that has further complicated matters, and we see that many of these groups, Hamas, Houthis, the Hezbollah, they are all supposed to be proxies of the Iranian regime. And Iran has been trying to whip up passions so that this war gets broadened, and the basic objective of Iran, as it has been said, that they want to completely exterminate Israel, completely do away so that fight against the existence of Israel. So that is what seems to be the, over the last 2 months or so, more than that, game plan. And we've seen a number of other countries, supposedly responsible regimes like Turkey and others. They've also been saying that, Hamas is not a terrorist organization, even as Abhinav, you mentioned about what UNSG had mentioned, that, the whole thing did not start only on the 7th of October. So I think there have been these voices. The next point that I would like to mention here is that this attack cannot, of course, be seen in isolation, but it is really an existential threat that Israel is experiencing, because it's a small country, both in terms of area as also in terms of population. And it is surrounded all around by such a large number of countries, many of whom have said, many of whom have not established diplomatic relations with Israel for one reason or the other. And several of them have also said that they want to see the end, the last of the existence of Israel and of the Jews. So it is really facing an existential threat. And that is why, the manner in which it has gone. Of course, initially there was much greater support for Israel because of the manner in which the terrorist attack has taken place. But after that, we've seen that the world opinion and the votes in the global community, in the multilateral institutions, they have started swinging to another side. But I really find this a travesty of justice, that in the latest UN General Assembly vote, where there is a demand for ceasefire, there is no mention whatsoever of the October 7 attack. There is no mention whatsoever of the hostages that are still in captivity with with Hamas. And there were additions that were proposed. There were modifications to the original resolution that were proposed, but they were defeated. And that I find very strange, because, if the multilateral institutions have to see that there is credibility as far as their own decisions are concerned, they have to appear to be balanced also. So I think just in isolation, using this, it is, coming out with a resolution. I don't think it serves any purpose. The institutions might think that it is going to apply greater pressure on Israel, which is waging now this war against Hamas. But I think it is not going to be a very productive development. Let me conclude quickly here to say that there are charges, and it has also been observed that Hamas uses the innocent people as human shields. And although there has been pressure on Israel from the United States, particularly, that there should be much greater targeted attacks against the civilians, but against the Hamas terrorists. But then we have seen that how the tunnels that Hamas has built, they have been under schools and under hospitals and under madrasas and under mosques, and it is those are also being used as shields by Hamas to launch their attacks. So I think that is an issue that also needs to be taken cognizance of before pronouncing oneself. And secondly, I think the numbers were mentioned by the first speaker. And I agree that, the damage and the destruction has been considerable. But I don't know how far these numbers can really be credible, because I don't, the whole issue of that hospital that was bombed, in which it was mentioned, I don't know how many, 500 or so many patients and children had died. I don't know whether there is any way of independently verifying these numbers in terms of total numbers, in terms of women killed, in terms of children killed. So I think there is, as far as the credibility of these numbers, that is, still a big question mark. Still needs to be verified, but the whole world seems to have taken that for granted. These are given by the Hamas Ministry of Health, so I think they really need to be taken with a pinch of salt. And I think the last point that I'd like to make here is that the international organizations like the United Nations Security Council, WHO, the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, I think all of them have huge responsibility. And whatever they do, they should appear to be balanced. They should appear to be credible. Only then will they be able to make an impact in terms of controlling the war. Not only this, but also dealing with the other challenges. Otherwise, the United Nations will lose its slowly, gradually, it's losing its credibility, its image is getting tarnished, its image is getting sullied, and that is neither good for it nor for the global order as it goes forward. So let me finish here, Abhinav. Thank you very much, and I once again apologize for the hoarseness of my voice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. You made some very succinct observations, and particularly the one about the credibility which the international organizations need to have when they are dealing and addressing issues like terrorism. Particularly that part, in that ceasefire, when they did not mention a single word about 7th October, or such things, definitely raise a big question mark on the credibility. I'm not an expert on these issues, but still, I feel that the world order which came after the Second World War. And so, I can tell you, like, from the history books and textbooks which we read. So in our history books and textbooks, what we were trained for and what we learned was that the world order which came after the Second World War was based on certain commonly accepted and consensus values like democracy, multiculturalism, equality, gender equality, rule of law, economic growth and development, scientific temperament, and rights for the LGBTQ community. Now, in current situation, we see a completely different kind of a challenge coming from these state proxies, non-state actors, which are dealing in and engaged in asymmetric warfare, and the kind of tactics and brutality which they are using, that doesn't fit and it doesn't align well with the norms and values which the world order followed, like after the Second World War. And even the multilateral organizations were largely formed within the framework of those commonly accepted values. So now the question arises, how do multilateral organizations deal with such non-state actors which are driven by religious extremism? And now you have even state actors like Iran, which are driven by the same kind of religious extremist ideology, which aims to completely wipe out the Jewish state or Jews. Even Turkey, for that matter, has those pan-Islamic ambitions of some sort of a Turkic empire. These are very different kind of challenges, new challenges, and certainly, that we are grappling with, and we really need to think about them. But yes, now I'm inviting another distinguished expert for today's panel, Dr. Goldman, please, over to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation like the others. You mentioned that I am president of the International Commission of Jurists. And that said, my remarks are mine alone and should not necessarily be taken as reflecting the remarks of the 60 commissioners and so forth that form the basis for governance of the organization. I've listened very carefully, and I must say that I agree with a good deal of what has been said. I'm a lawyer by training, an international lawyer who specialized on issues dealing with the law of armed conflict, as well as international terrorism. In fact, I was the United Nations independent expert on terrorism and human rights under the old Human Rights Commission. So I am very familiar with these subjects. I think there's a kind of Pollyannish view when people look at the establishment of multilateral institutions and so forth, and believe that when states enter either in New York or in Geneva into these UN offices, they somehow park their national interests and they walk in as good global citizens. That is not the reality. The system really has not functioned as envisioned, because many of us know that almost, if the end of World War II, we had the advent of the Cold War, which very much significantly colored the outlooks of various countries, and obviously the chief organ for the maintenance of peace and security in the world, the Security Council. The victorious allies, the principal ones, have veto powers, and we have had a consistent pattern of the United States, what was the Soviet Union, Russia, China, and so forth, protecting their clients. Quite frankly, the only time when I think that the system as envisioned worked very, very well was in 1992, when we had Gorbachev, we had the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, when Saddam invaded Kuwait, and the Security Council united, authorized the use of force and so forth to eject Saddam from Kuwait and to restore that state's sovereignty and independence. It worked very well, but that was the exception. The other thing is, and I would certainly identify with the ambassador, what role the UN can and will play, particularly when the hostilities come to a close in Gaza, remains to be seen. Certainly, the track record of the United Nations in dealing with Israel, both within its multilateral institutions, if you look at the old UN Human Rights Commission and the Council, it has not been even-handed, in my view, at all. And I think the most recent, as the ambassador indicated, the vote in the General Assembly, without even referencing the horrors of October 7, is illustrative of what I think has been a consistent pattern. The reality is, and I'm sure that others put it, this war is not one in isolation. It's taking place in a very volatile part of the world, and just as Yemen and just as Syria figure in geopolitical terms with their backers and so forth, and against the backdrop of obviously this sort of Cold War between Sunni and Shia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and so all of these things figure into these things. These states have interests and so forth. In the particular case that I think what will happen now is I don't think Gutierrez, quite frankly, has played a very constructive role at all. I think many of the specialized agencies have spoken with greater moderation, and I think that they will have a role in Israel and the United States and so forth, supports their efforts. But essentially, and I'm going to be very clear, there is only one state that can play a moderating role on Israel and that will force, if anything, the shaping of what peace will look like, and that is the United States. And this is a very complex relationship. We have Biden is paying, to some extent, a political price, whether it's long-term, we'll have to see. But in their support for Israel, at the same time, the administration, I think, has walked fairly well a very delicate line in terms of making clear to Israel that the United States is utterly committed to a two-state solution. And I think the Israelis are being told in private, you can't expect every 4 years for a situation, the status quo is untenable. And the problem is the Israelis are probably going to have to be taken screaming and hollering, at least on the right, to see that a two-state solution is the only viable solution. Now, that comes within the framework of resolutions of the United Nations and so forth. But this is where I think diplomacy from the United States is going to play the decisive role, because the United States is the one, obviously, who not only gives political backing, but military backing, and so forth. And we have a very weakened government in Israel at the present time. So as I said, I'm not very Pollyannish in terms of the role. It's as I said, I think the UN has not historically played a terribly balanced role when it comes to Israel, attacks against Israel. Israel has had a philosophy which is questionable in terms of their conduct of hostilities. There's been tremendous, and in my view, at this point, excessive use of force, in the sense that the collateral damage is really one of sheer and utter devastation. And I must say, the other day, the killing tragically of the 3 Israeli hostages and the circumstances in which those took place would lead a reasonable person to believe that these are rules of engagement that are somewhat questionable. I mean, it is almost as though you have a free fire zone, which is against the law of armed conflict. So there are many things that are ongoing, but I think we have to be realistic. The UN was never in the Security Council, much less the General Assembly, was going to substitute for the major powers and in protecting their interests in the world. I just think that is an unrealistic proposition to think. Obviously, if you have nuclear weapons or if you have other kind of WMD, you may be in a much better position. I have no doubt, for example, that if Russia had not had nuclear weapons and so forth, after the invasion or the second major invasion that took place in Ukraine, that NATO would have had a response, and I mean a military response. This is the way the world is. If you have nuclear weapons and so forth, you are going to be able to do certain things and get away with things that a country such as Iraq is not going to be able to deal with. So I'm hopeful that these specialized agencies of the United Nations, together with the tremendous role that are played by civil society organizations, are in delivering of relief and helping in reconstruction and so forth. But the key to the settlement, I think, of the underlying causes that the United States is I think, signaling very clearly what the outcome must be for continued U.S. support, that we're not going to continue to underwrite every 4 years a devastation of Gaza and so forth, only to have a perpetuation of the same kind of policies out of the Israeli government. Let me conclude with just one other observation, because I think that the ambassador was right. We have seen the emergence, we've always, of non-state armed actors in the world. I recall very well from my work with Human Rights Watch and so forth in the Central American armed conflicts, that we had non-state actors that paid lip service to compliance with international humanitarian law, had a political wing that sought legitimacy and so forth. These are not the kind of non-state actors that we have seen emerge. Hamas is a perfect example. Boko Haram, ISIL, and so forth. These are more fanatical organizations and so forth. They reject entirely the law of armed conflict, and indeed they use their violations of the law of armed conflict by posting these and doing fundraising and getting recruits. This is something that requires a lot more systematic thought, because right now it looks like the only way one can deal with these people, given the fact that they are not the traditional rebel or insurgent groups that we saw in the past, with a clear-cut political agenda that could be negotiated, very much like what we had in Colombia a variety of years ago after a long-standing armed conflict basically came to an end. They had a political agenda. What is the political agenda of these other groups that are based on a twisted religious conception and so forth that rejects man-made law, which plays into the rule-based order that we have? This is a real challenge, and I don't think it has been adequately dealt with by either the International Court of Justice or, quite frankly, many of the UN modalities. So with that, I will terminate my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goldman, for your insightful remarks. And particularly, I'm really very impressed with that very fine distinction which you made between the routine non-state actors and these fanatical, extremist, religious, terrorist actors. Now, this is the distinction, I guess, we were all missing out on this part, and, we were trying to apply the similar standards on these groups also. Because so I did my PhD on terrorism and counterterrorism. And whenever I interacted with my mentors, they said that, no, you have to bring in the standard theories of the formation of terrorist groups, with these groups. So my focus was on Jaish-e-Mohammed. And I realized in my research that that's totally different from what your other like Colombian FARC rebels and other like ultra Marxist rebels. It's completely different. They have very well-defined political objectives. And there are groups like Jamaat-e-Islami or these religious extremist fanatical actors or Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed. For them, the question is entirely different. They don't want to negotiate with the government because they don't accept your goddamn existence. I mean, for them, entire humanity which doesn't conform to their religious ideology deserves to be eliminated or converted to their beliefs. So that's a completely different breed that we are talking. Thank you very much once again. Now I'll invite Dr. Ziv. He is from Israel, and definitely he's. We can tell situation like what's happening there. We get more insightful and facts from the ground. Dr. Ziv, over to you.
First of all, thank you for inviting me and also giving me the benefit of being the last and being able to listen to the positions of my colleagues and try to connect the threads when I speak. And that's what I'll try to do, and I think I'll do it by presenting two perspectives that would not necessarily be completely non-contradictory with one another. And one position is more objective as the person that researches, among others, the history of international law. I want to comment on some attribute of our discourse as international lawyers. We have the tendency to create institutions, praise them, and set high goals for them, and then getting disappointed from these institutions just only to make reform, again promise ourselves that now this new institution would fulfill its promise only to be disappointed again. And I think that it tells more about us and less about the international organizations. International organizations are human creations, and humans are imperfect by definition. And therefore, the institutions we create are imperfect by definition. And it's true that we should aspire to improve them and continue to improve them, but they'll continue to be imperfect. And some of our expectations are this built-in ethos into the international law community of us believing that we are always advancing humanity, instead of understanding that some things would stay the same, and the existence of institution is better than the non-existence of institution, but they are always going to be imperfect. And sometimes agreeing of what is the flaw and what is the element, the good element of the institution is a matter of perspective. When I listen to Professor Lob, some of the things that he mentioned that are a problem with the institution from my perspective or from another personal perspective might be the benefits. and it's okay. It's the main purpose of this institution is to gather people in order for them to have a forum to discuss and talk, because discussing and talking is better than not having this institution in which they can discuss and talk, which would leave only the option of conflict. And after I said that, I want to shift from the head of the very objective academic historians and put a very Israeli hat and present things from the perspective of how they look from this side of the ground. So first of all, something that I see that is not realized by many people from outside, and even though the ambassador was very keen to notice them, is how personal this event is and how different this event is from previous conflicts between Israel and Gaza. So I'll give you it as personal as it can be. I'm sitting in Yavne. It's 20-minute drive from Tel Aviv when there's no traffic jam. At the same time, it's 40 minutes from Gaza. On the 7th of October, we, with our children, ran back and forth to the bomb shelter almost 50 times. We know people that got killed. We know people that got that are hostages. We have friends that have family members that got killed. I'm not certain how safe if a ceasefire would be declared tomorrow. I'm not certain how safe it would be to live in Yavne, because the terrorists that crossed the fence didn't get the northest point that they reached is rather close to where I live. I had a shrapnel of a rocket landing in my garden while my children were in the living room. So it's all very personal. And Israel is an extremely small country. It's if I compare it to Rajasthan, Rajasthan is 15 times larger than Israel size-wise, and population-wise, only Rajasthan, not India, only Rajasthan is 7 times larger than Israel. And therefore, everything is very familiar. We know people that have experienced the horrors, and if the operation would end tomorrow with a ceasefire, it's not. There's a huge portion of the Israeli population that would not feel safe to stay at its home. So I know that currently the imagery that is portrayed is coming from Gaza, but there's true and actual concern on the Israeli side as well for our well-being. And I think that issue is not it's not internalized enough in public discourse and around the world, and it's not internalized enough in the international organizations. And therefore, at this point in time, there's a true crisis of distrust between Israeli public and international organizations. And some of it is because of this lack of acknowledgement or realization of the danger on the Israeli side. And some of it, by some organizations, are clear demonstrations of bias. If I take you back to the first few weeks of this war, before Israel had entered Gaza, before even there was a large-scale bombings, and you already saw various organs of the UN refusing to condemn the attack of the 7th of October or condemning it in a very, very mild language. And that created in the Israeli public a high level of distrust to this organization to an extent that is stronger than before, both because the event is much is more emotional and stronger than previous events, and because Israelis had assumed that at least in this case, when the horrors were so, when the atrocities were so grave, the reaction would be less sided than before, and it leads to, and it leads to this echo effect, because there are these organs that have always been biased. When I taught my students, I always said, yeah, there are these, UNRWA is always biased, but the Secretary General is usually non-biased. But I'm not certain that I'm able to tell that to my students again. And even when you get to the ICRC, their reaction in the first months of the conflict were not balanced. Even later, when they praise the return of convicted Palestinian terrorists as if they were the equivalent of the hostages held by Israelis, and when they are reprimanded for that, they stop doing it in English Twitter and continue to do it in Arab Twitter, that shows indications of bias, even in an organization that until now we had assumed that he is non-biased. You see it also with the ICC prosecutor. The previous prosecutor has worked hard to project a non-biased stand, and the assumption was that the current prosecutor would be even more balanced and non-biased than than the predecessor. And what you saw is, despite his speech that was commendable, you saw that it took him a month to make this speech. It took him a week to give any comment. And you also see the personnel that he recruited. You see in that category certain individuals that are clearly biased against Israel and have made certain very problematic statements over the past 2 months. So from an Israeli perspective, it's a moment of a crisis and distrust between Israeli society, and I'm notice that I'm saying Israeli society and not Israeli government, because the Israeli government is enjoying very little support currently, even within the Israel. So it's a moment of crisis between the Israeli public and the international organizations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ziv, for giving us an insider perspective as you're reporting the situation right from the battlefront. So now I open the house for the question and answer session. First question I think we have from Mr. Jayendra Singh, and I'll just read out the question. How do deficiencies in international law contribute to the perpetuation of discussed atrocities and a lack of effective enforcement mechanisms by international organizations in the context of Israel-Hamas conflict? It's open to all. Dr.
Perhaps
Goldman, would you like to
say something?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Look, one has to be realistic. We have more law today dealing with the conduct of armed conflict than we've ever had in history. But part of the issue is it requires good faith commitment on the part of all the warring parties. What the public does not understand, and I've spent a good deal of time since the war began, as I've taught IHL and I've practiced in the area for 47 years. And it gets into the issue that we mentioned before, the distinction between the old style non-state actor with a political agenda versus the new kind. The law of war seeks essentially to protect the civilian population and those who are out of the fight by placing limits on means and methods of warfare. But in order to do that, it requires the parties to faithfully implement their respective obligations. The public at large thinks it is the attacking party, those who launch attacks and plan attacks, who have the sole responsibility for avoiding collateral damage. That is not the case. The party that controls the civilian population has essentially a co-equal responsibility not to place their civilians at heightened risk of harm. In the record of Hamas, not only in this armed conflict, but in past armed conflicts, has been to do the opposite. Now, once that formula, if you start, in effect, using your civilian population to shield military objectives and so forth, and you add to that the density of Gaza, it is a recipe for disaster, because even using the most advanced precision-guided munitions, you are going to create extensive collateral damage. And since we are living in an age now where we see attacks instantaneously, everybody's a reporter with a cell phone today. And all what people see is dead children and women. The conclusion is the Israelis are deliberately attacking the civilian population and so forth. This is precisely what Hamas wants. And so the issue is not a matter of more law. We have, and I hope that the International Criminal Court will undertake a rigorous investigation of violations of IHL that have occurred. And let me make a point on this. The clearest cut violations that have taken place up to this point are not ones that the Israelis have caused. It's Hamas. The taking of hostages is a war crime. The murder and torture of 1,200 civilians is a war crime, irrespective of whether it's an international or a non-international armed conflict. It is much more difficult in making a case that a particular attack qualifies as indiscriminate in the sense it's a very big burden for a prosecutor to sustain, because you have to show that, in effect, that the pre-attack estimate in good faith showed there was going to be foreseeable excessive collateral damage when weighed against the military advantage. That is a very, very big burden. I have expressed publicly my concern with the way the bombings have been taking place, and particularly the use in this densely populated area of dumb bombs. The Israelis should not be using those. They have advanced more sophisticated weaponry and so forth that can reduce blast radius and so forth. But this cannot excuse Hamas from what they have done. And it gets you back into the new kind of non-state actor that we have today. When you have groups that are dedicated with, and in the case of Hamas, let's be clear, from its charter, it is a genocidal intent. They want to destroy a nation and its people. That is their agenda. They are pleased with the results of what has been done. They've said so. It's led to the devastation of the country. They have a major role in this. This has to be examined, and I hope it will be examined and so forth, and appropriate charges will be brought. Now, this in no way excuses various things that the Israelis have done, but there are two sides to the conflict. And so is my view on this, and whether we're talking about the way that various non-state actors have been operating in Africa, where they've been operating in Syria and in Iraq and so forth, you're dealing with a different kind of group that does not accept the very fundamentals of the international legal system and they reject the notions on which IHL is premised. And this is one of the dilemmas and so forth that we have today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Goldman. Next, we have a comment
Abhinav,
which is
could I
about.
make
Can I add a bit?
brief
Sure,
comments
sure, sir,
on
sure.
this?
Please, please.
Yeah, okay.
Sure.
So very quickly, one was on this particular question, and as far as international law is concerned, I think what really needs also to be recognized is that international law is very, very different from national law, because within a country, there are institutions that are available, that are present to enforce that law. Now, as far as international law is concerned, basically, it's known more as a soft law because it really depends upon the goodwill and the good intentions of those who have signed on to the document to be able to observe that. And so that is why you find that there are, the international system does not have an enforcement machinery and enforcement instrument by which it can do. So I think these are some of the aspects where the international law is lacking. It is weak in that sense. And of course, I don't think anyone would really provide it with all that much of power and authority. There are, of course, certain cases, when there is a UN resolution to do something, or when there was, as far as Libya was concerned and R2P was initiated, was enforced. So there are certain cases, of course, and of course, going forward, if the International Court of Justice takes cognizance of certain developments and certain actions. So I think there are these aspects of international law. Let me very quickly mention one or two other aspects. What Professor Goldman also mentioned, the differences that these terrorist organizations like the Hamas, Boko Haram, Jaish, as you mentioned, Abhinav, these are organizations that do not follow the rules of the game in terms of how a conflict or a war has to be conducted. But that does not absolve the other countries who have signed on to these documents that they should also be, be set free from observing and following these particular laws, international laws. And so I think in this particular case, you see that people tend to say that, okay, Hamas has done what it has done because it has not signed on to those agreements. But as far as Israel is concerned, it has signed those, and so it is bound by that. So really, it is fighting against that with its hands tied, behind its back. In that sense, that is how it should be dealing with it. The last point I want to make also, because we have the three other speakers are not from India, basically very quickly to tell them as to how India has responded. I think India was one of the first countries. Prime Minister Modi himself was one of the first world leaders to, in no uncertain terms, totally unequivocally and very clearly condemn the attack on the 7th of October. And also, he extended full support to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in terms of the action that Israel was taking when the two leaders spoke with each other on the 10th of October. And I think going forward also, the first resolution, India had abstained. And the reason why India had abstained was because there was no reference, there was no mention of the 7th October attack. And also there was no reference to the hostages. Even in its explanation of the vote for the latest resolution, India made it very clear whenever we speak about the Israel-Hamas conflict, right at the beginning is the fact we mention the atrocities and the barbarism of the 7th October attack that was perpetrated by the Hamas. So I think that is needs to be taken cognizance of, that as far as terrorism is concerned, as far as hostages are concerned, India has been very, very clear and categorical in condemning that. The last point, what I think Professor Goldman also mentioned, that if Russia did not have nuclear weapons, then maybe NATO, would have its response would have been different. I think if Ukraine had nuclear weapons, it had not given up its nuclear weapons in the 1990s, then possibly the response of Russia also would have been quite different. And that is why what we see, what is happening in North Korea, that it is carrying out all these tests, and it has, even as far as America is concerned, not to speak about Japan and South Korea, all of them are so visibly worried about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
May
Mr.
I
Sajjanhar.
add
Thank you.
two small comments, really short?
Sure, please.
One
Please.
to Professor Goldman. A fact that is less known outside of Israel, one of the reasons for the amount of use of dumb bombs is the need to conserve smart bombs in case a front in Lebanon would be open. So because there's a huge amount of weaponry that was hidden by Hezbollah under civilian houses in various villages in Lebanon, and Israel needs to conserve certain amount of the bombs, smart bombs for that. There's no choice but to use dumb bombs in Gaza, or the amount of dumb bombs that is used in Gaza. And the second comment is to the person that asked the question, and my request for that person: please do not lose hope with international law, and not even with the law of war. The law of war, international law in general, and the law of war even specifically, is abided by more times than you can think. But most times it is abided by simply non-events. They are not reported in the news. What is reported in the news is the violations. And therefore we have a tendency to overcount the amount of violations and undercount the amount of time that the law is obeyed by. And so please remember all these cases of when the law is obeyed, and don't lose faith with international law.
Thank you, Dr. Zeeb. I have a question. Regarding the settlement or the arrangement of Gaza after, like, Israel, whatever Israel does, let's say Israel conquers Gaza, or after this war is over, we are all mulling over the question of, like, what happens in Gaza after the war. Like, what is the government arrangement? What is the governance, civil society, so governance arrangement, administrative arrangement in that region? Arabs are reluctant. I mean, do you think that the international organizations, maybe say UN, can play some role in the reconstruction or in setting up some sort of an effective governance mechanism in Gaza after the war?
You're asking me, or the question is?
This is open to everyone. You and Dr. Eric, whoever wants to answer, please.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I was actually going to make some comments about that, even in my remarks, but obviously, and as was mentioned by other speakers, the international community, the UN and other international organizations can play a constructive role. But I think, one question we have to ask ourselves is obviously the role that the UN and other international organizations play is critical. I mean, it's critical during this conflict. It's been critical before in terms of providing essential goods and services. And yet on the flip side, some have viewed these institutions and their activities as enabling, as was mentioned previously, an unsustainable status quo, taking the onus off of state, non-state, quasi-state actors of effective governance, of lacking the political will to change the political status quo, to improve the political and socioeconomic conditions on the ground. And so I think that, as was stated, that while we could see perhaps, and there's another question about whether there should be international peacekeeping forces like we have in Lebanon, which obviously is highly debatable. There have been, I think, some pros and cons to UNIFIL's record on the Lebanese-Israeli border that we can debate and discuss. But I think ultimately, this is going to come down to the actors on the ground. The Israelis, the Palestinians, I mean, right now the position of the Israelis is that they want to take a long-term security position in Gaza, which the United States disagrees with, which may not be in Israel's best interests from a national security standpoint. And yet the question is, who fills the vacuum, right? So the United States is pressing the Palestinian Authority to do so with certain conditionalities. The Palestinian Authority is weak, is illegitimate, has issues not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank. So the conditionalities of the U.S. government, of the Biden administration, is that and speaking with Mahmoud Abbas, is that there's serious reforms that are undertaken, that there's new blood that comes into the leadership of the Palestinian Authority and Fatah and the other groups, that even bringing back people with experience that were in Gaza, involved in governance and security pre-2011, before the elections, when Hamas took over and even forced Fatah out, should be considered. And yet I think the elephant in the room is going to be, how do you integrate Hamas into this equation? Because, despite what Israel says, I think it's highly skeptical that you can eliminate or eradicate or dismantle a group like Hamas, whether you want to call it a terrorist organization or not. It's a multi-dimensional movement. It's part of the population, right? So it's a very difficult, I think, a complicated situation about how you could actually have a viable governance and security mechanism after this conflict, and particularly in the wake of the devastation that we're seeing on the ground.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Eric. Dr. Z, would you like to add something to what Dr. Eric said?
I say like that. There's a difference between what the Israeli government wants and what my position is, or the position of many Israelis. That's one distinction that needs to be made. And the other thing that I want to reflect is the concerns from the Israeli side. First of all, the Palestinian Authority has proven weak, lacking legitimacy within its public, and corrupt, extremely corrupt. And it wasn't able to sustain power in Gaza last time for more than 2 years after the Israeli evacuation. Moreover, the Palestinian Authority, irrespective of what Israel would do, and I agree that Israeli government has done a lot to weaken the Palestinian Authority over the last decade, and sadly so, I think that the Palestinian Authority is going to weaken even more in the coming years. And an element that is too often forgotten is the fact that Abu Mazen is 88 and a heavy smoker. So there's no democratic elections that are continuously postponed in the Palestinian Authority. So at a certain point, and I wish him a long life, at a certain point after his death, there's going to be a power struggle within the Palestinians. And if I may, I'll give a very pessimistic outlook. That's when the real bloodshed is gonna erupt, because the struggle within the Palestinian society would very quickly cross over to the Israeli side, because the different factions would attack Israel in order to gain legitimacy within different elements of the Palestinian society. So the worst is yet to come. I'm sad to tell. So when designing the day after in Gaza, we need to take into account also the day after Abu Mazen in the territories, and trying to create some semi-stable, and I'm not very optimistic about even the possibility of doing so, something that would be sufficiently stable to sustain the earthquake that would happen the day after Abu Mazen.
Thank you very much. So one more question. Situation, I mean, in case if Hezbollah continues the attacks and the situation escalates, adding another dimension to it, like as the day before yesterday, we had an interview discussion with Dr. Ephraim Menbar, who is the head of GISS. And he mentioned that Iran is more or less a step short of acquiring a bomb. So if that happens, definitely given Iran's intentions to annihilate a Jewish state, the Israel doesn't have a choice, maybe just to go for preemptive strikes or something like that. So if that is the situation, and if it comes to that state, what role do you see for the international organization? I mean, what can they do? It's open to all, like anyone.
I mean, look,
take this question.
I have lived in Israel. I've lived in Iran. I've done field work there extensively. Lebanon, Hezbollah territories. Right now, we're taken for granted. There's an assumption in this virtual room that Iran's priority is to annihilate Israel, and of course, it's made statements to that effect. But I think Iran's number one priority, or at least again, like Professor Bohrer or Professor Zvi said, there's distinguished between governments and societies. But I think the ultimate priority of the Iranian government is regime survival. Okay, and the Iranians understand that they have conventionally inferior capabilities, not just to the United States, but also to Israel, which, by the way, if we want to talk about international law, is a government with a nuclear arsenal that has not signed the NPT, that has some extremist elements in its government. Okay, we have not brought that up. I mean, we have, to the extent that we've talked about the Israeli right. But in any event, as we see what Iran is doing, and I would also caution to say that Iran's proxies and partners, that it's a complex relationship, like every relationship. They do not just march to the orders of Tehran. Tehran does not just give these groups green lights. I mean, it does to some extent. We know that for years it is supported these groups, right? But these groups also have a say in what they do and don't do. Okay, so it's much more complicated than as we're seeing. Actually, these groups are set. They're firing off rockets and missiles, but they are operating, given the capabilities that they have, with constraint. And that is also part of Iran. That's why there have been conversations recently between, as we saw in Doha, between the Hamas officials and the Iranian foreign minister and other officials. So the Iranians, they want to inflict pain on Israel. They want to inflict pain on the United States. They want to inflict pain on global shipping, and send messages that they're not going to stand by just as this conflict continues in Gaza. But they're not going to cross. I mean, again, this is what the calculations are. This is not necessarily what the outcome will be, right? There's unintended consequences and outcomes. They're trying not to cross, for the time being, red lines that will invite a disproportionate conventional response and put this regime in Iran and put its partners and proxies in the line of fire and jeopardize their survival. So I think we should be very nuanced in the way that we discuss these things and the way that we think about them.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Eric. And I hope that it goes as per the calculations that we have made, or the strategic community has made, and Iran doesn't cross that red line. Next, we have a comment about Dr. Goldman's remarks, and I'll just read it out. And there's also a question in that. Dr. Goldman mentioned the coloring of outlooks of various countries and the Security Council post-Cold War. What is coloring the outlook of countries and UNSC on the issue of Israel-Hamas war? And how does this affect the processes of peacemaking? Dr. Goldman, over to you.
I'm not sure I fully understood the import of the question.
Okay, I'll just, Jayendra, can you be a little more specific regarding this question? Can you listen to me? Can you hear me, Jayendra?
Yes, sir, I'm audible.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry, I just, it was a very context specific question, I guess. That's why it came out this way. So essentially what I wanted to know is, what are the various forces in the in the play which are happening, which are coloring the outlook of countries, maybe regional countries or the bigger nations, in how they are looking or taking actions towards this war itself. Like you mentioned, there was some coloring in the post-Cold War region. I'm not aware of that, but I wanted to know what exactly is happening in this one, and what are the implications of it in the peacemaking process, which we are going to see. I hope that made it clearer.
Okay, I'll try to make it a little more. I think he wants to know about the different actors and the political interplay between them in the UNSC debates. I guess the hidden vested interests impacting the overall peace processes.
Well, if it in part is directed towards me, look, there is so much back channeling and diplomacy that is going on, particularly with the United States, with Saudi Arabia, with the Gulf states, and the like. And as the professor said, obviously, and I agree with his calculation entirely, about Iran and the self-survival and how they've been playing their cards up to this point. This is about the messiest situation I have seen in my professional career, because you have discredited leaders on both sides. And you have, probably as a result of what has happened with, even if we discount by 30% the amount of civilian deaths and so forth, Hamas obviously, they're going to have new recruits. You're not going to be able to kill an idea, what they stand for, and so forth. So piecing together something or some kind of government with new people, it may very well be. We've seen political prescription and so forth throughout history in the 20th century of military governments turning over governments and the banning political parties, but they're acceptable candidates, but de facto they share the same ideology and the like. You're never going to be able to, I think, form something, whatever this is going to look like, with people who do not harbor many of the same beliefs as does Hamas. But I think what's going to be key here are what the Sunni states are going to be willing to do and how much support they will give to the United States and the like. Because I don't see any other solution, quite honestly, immediately when the fighting stops, for a de facto Israeli occupation for some period of time. And it may very well be prolonged, because the gap there is going to be, who is going to fill the gap? Who's going to fill this gap? And so far, if we take the Sunni states at their word, they have no interest in being seen as proxies and pulling, Israel's chestnuts out of the fire. You're going to have, obviously, a disarticulated, if not decapitated, within Gaza itself, of Hamas. The Israelis will never let them assume that. So I think for a short term, you are going to, until the United States and other states working with these other regional powers, and here is where perhaps, for instance, maybe the United Nations could play a role. But I think it's going to be a big power game with regional powers, with the United States effectively protecting Israel's interests, but at the same time pushing Israel to make very uncomfortable concessions in terms of what they're going to have to do. But I think de facto there's going to be an occupation.
If I could,
Dr. Goldman. Yeah.
If I could add a few comments. One, I agree with Professor Loben, but I think that this was also the assumption regarding Hamas. The assumption regarding Hamas was that they would fall in love with power and for that reason would not attack Israel. this was the reason why the conflicts until now have been limited or not as extensive as the current one. And they got to the fork in the road in which they either fully accept the role as the government and limit their military role, or are ready to give up their role as government and return to the role as a terrorist organization. And Israel had assumed that they would choose the first option, and they chose the latter of returning to be a terrorist organization. So that concern is relevant also for Iran. There's a likelihood of at a certain point you have a government that would make a similar choice of escalating the conflict. And it's also relevant to the point of involving Hamas. Even and I'm not a great supporter of the current Israeli government, would not accept any solution in which Hamas is involved. And it's not that we are naive to think that we're going to kill an idea. The aspiration is to have Hamas at the scale that it exists today in the West Bank, of a very limited organization that once in a while tries to do something, but is without extensive power and can be dealt with by the Israeli security forces. So it's not this. I know that sometimes in the international press it's presented as if there's this naive aspiration of annihilating Hamas in the sense of having it disappear, but this is the actual Israeli aspiration, to have it in the size and strength that it exists at the West Bank. And that means cutting it from power and not involving it in the power scheme that would happen in the end of the war.
Thanks, Dr. Ziv. I guess, well, that means Israel has a lot more mess on the platter to deal with. Civic administration, post-war local arrangements, amenities, governance, and also dealing with the existing or the leadership of Hamas, which is still hiding in the Gaza tunnels. Besides that, the leadership of Hamas, which will find safe havens in countries like Turkey, Malaysia, Pakistan. Again, that's a big challenge to deal with them, because they will start operating from those distant quarters of the world. So Israel has a lot more to deal with. Two final questions to Ambassador Sajjanhar. Sir, my first question. Why is India not declaring Hamas a terrorist organization? And second one is more fundamental. Do you think that existing international organizations, I mean, the way they are working, they're not able to grapple with the changed world order? They are very unrepresentative. We have been trying to, get more representation. India should be the member of UNSC, something very fundamental. So please answer these two questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Abhinav, for these questions. I think this is, India's declaration, identification of Hamas as a terrorist organization. In my view, it is a matter of time. And maybe, the way the churn is taking place, the way the turmoil is taking place, particularly as far as the Arab world is concerned, particularly as far as the Arab street is concerned, the manner in which it has come out. So I think under those circumstances, maybe India does not wish to take this particular decision, this particular plunge. But definitely, I think after the 7th October attacks, India has mentioned these are terrorist attacks, and terrorist attacks are carried out by terrorist organizations. So I think if not de jure, but de facto, we have identified Hamas as a terrorist organization. And as I said, it's a matter of time. Maybe, the government does not consider the time to be opportune at the moment to make this declaration. But I think it will be coming, even if it takes a little time, but it will definitely surely be coming. The second question, you're very right. I think the international organizations are particularly, UN Security Council. It is representative of 1945 out of the end of the Second World War, where the whole, in terms of the numbers, there were just 53 countries that were members of the United Nations at that time. Today, there are more than 190 countries. So, and there has been no change as far as the UN Security Council is concerned, and even as far as the veto of the 5 permanent members is concerned. So I think definitely that needs a change. Today, India is the 5th largest economy. Just yesterday, day before yesterday, what the IMF, and they've been saying it now for the last so many months, that while there is gloom and despondency everywhere in the world, India is a star performer. India is the only bright light as far as this global economy is concerned. So India is growing. India is doing well. It's likely to become the 3rd largest economy. And even otherwise, I think what India has shown is that when India grows, then the countries around it also, it tries to take them along with it. They also grow. It is not, India is not in the business of usurping aggrandizement of power. So I think definitely the international organizations, particularly the United Nations, needs to be made much more representative. And India needs to get its own role. We have this G4 body. It is Japan, Germany, India, Brazil, who sort of deserve representation in at the high table in the UN Security Council. So let's see how that also pans out. I think that is also, in my view, a matter of time, although it might take a little longer than but there is so much of movement, so much of change that is taking place in the world that I feel that that will also be, slowly, but definitely surely it will happen in the not too distant future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. So now we come to the end of this amazing and very insightful discussion. I would like to thank all the distinguished experts who joined us today and also the participants who registered for this event. One common takeaway which I get, which I conclude from this discussion is that certainly there's a big role, there's a big space for the international organizations to play in this world order, but they have to be more representative and more credible. And when I say credible, when I talk about credibility, I would like to make it very specific that they need to call spade a spade. They need to call Hamas clearly a terrorist organization. And also, sending humanitarian aid to a conflict-ridden state, conflict-ridden situation is an absolutely great idea, but they also need to make sure that that humanitarian aid is not diverted to terror funding. Humanitarian aid is not used for making missiles and bombing civilians. So these are the issues, I guess, which we all need to think about. We had such a brilliant and amazing discussion. Once again, I would like to thank all of you for joining us today, and we look forward to continue this constructive engagement with all of you. Tomorrow evening, we are going to have a very good discussion on the condition of Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. Ambassador Dinkar Srivastava, I guess, Ambassador Sajjanhar must be knowing him. He has written an excellent book on the conditions of the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, the legal aspects, the terror-related aspects, the sociological aspects. The discussion is at 5:30 in the evening. And in case if you would like to attend the discussion, please join us. I can ask Preeti, our senior program coordinator, to send you the meeting link. Thank you very much.